Section 5 of The Story of the Trapper by Agnes Christina Laut. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ted Leinhardt. Chapter 5. Mr. Astor's Company Encounters New Opponents. That Andrew Henry, whom Lisa had sought when he pursued the Astorians up the Missouri, continued to be dogged by misfortune on the west side of the mountains. Game was scarce, and his half-starving followers were scattered, some to the British posts in the north, some to the Spaniards in the south, and some to the nameless graves of the mountains. Henry forced his way back over the divide and met Lisa in the Araucania country. The British War broke out, and the Missouri Company were compelled to abandon the dangerous territory of the Blackfeet, who could purchase arms from the British traders, raid the Americans, and scurry back to Canada. When Lisa died in 1820, more than 300 Missouri men were again in the mountains, but they suffered the same ill luck. Jones and Emil's party were annihilated by the Blackfeet, and Pilcher, who succeeded to Lisa's position and dauntlessly crossed over to the Columbia, had all his supplies stolen, reaching the Hudson's Bay post, Fort Colville, almost destitute. The British rivals received him with that hospitality for which they were renowned when trade was not involved, and gave him escort up the Columbia, down the Athabasca and Saskatchewan to Red River, thence overland to the Mandan country and St. Louis. These two disasters marked the wane of the Missouri Company. But like the shipwrecked sailor, no sooner safe on land than he must to sea again, the indomitable Andrew Henry linked his fortunes with General Ashley of St. Louis. Gathering to the new standard Campbell, Bridger, Fitzpatrick, Beckworth, Smith, and the Sublets, men who made the Rocky Mountain trade famous, Ashley and Henry led 100 men to the mountains the first year and 200 the next. In that time, not less than 25 lives were lost among Araucarias and Blackfeet. Few pelts were obtained, and the expeditions were a loss. But in 1824 came a change. Smith met Hudson's Bay trappers loaded with beaver pelts in the Columbia Basin, west of the Rockies. They had become separated from their leader, Alexander Ross, an old historian. Details of this bargain will never be known, but when Smith came east, he had the Hudson's Bay furs. This was the first brush between Rocky Mountain men and the Hudson's Bay, and the mountain trappers scored. Henceforth, to save time, the active trappers met their supplies annually at a rendezvous in the mountains in Pierre's Hole, a broad valley below the Tetons, or Jackson's Hole, east of the former, or Ogden's Hole at Salt Lake. 17 Rocky Mountain men had been massacred by the Snake Indians in the Columbia Basin, but that did not deter General Ashley himself from going up the Platte, across the divide to Salt Lake. Here he found Peter Ogden, a Hudson's Bay trapper, with an enormous prize of beaver pelts. When the Hudson's Bay man left Salt Lake, he had no furs, and when General Ashley came away, his packers were laden with $250,000 worth of pelts. This was the second brush between Rocky Mountain and Hudson's Bay, and again the mountaineers scored. The third encounter was more to the credit of both companies. After 3 years' wanderings, Smith found himself stranded and destitute at the British post of Fort Vancouver. 15 of his men had been killed, his horses taken, and peltries stolen. The Hudson's Bay sent a punitive force to recover his property, gave him a $20,000 draft for the full value of the recovered furs, and sent him up the Columbia. Thenceforth, Rocky Mountain trappers in Hudson's Bay respected each other's rights in the valley of the Columbia, but southward the old code prevailed. Fitzpatrick, a Rocky Mountain trader, came on the same poor Peter Ogden at Salt Lake trading with the Indians, and at once plied the argument of whiskey so actively that the furs destined for Red River went over the mountains to St. Louis. The trapper probably never heard of a nemesis, but a curious retribution seemed to follow on the heels of outrage. Lisa had tried to balk the Astorians, and the Missouri Company went down before Indian hostility. The Nor'westers jockeyed the Astorians out of their possessions and were in league with murderers at the massacre of Seven Oaks, but the Nor'westers were jockeyed out of existence by the Hudson's Bay under Lord Selkirk. The Hudson's Bay had been guilty of rank outrage, particularly on the Saskatchewan, where Northwest partners were seized, manacled, and sent to a wilderness, and now the Hudson's Bay were cheated, cajoled, overreached by the Rocky Mountain trappers, and the Rocky Mountain trappers, in their turn, met a rival that could out-cheat their cheatery. In 1831, the mountains were overrun with trappers from all parts of America. Men from every state in the Union, those restless spirits who have pioneered every great movement of the race, turned their faces to the wilderness for furs as a later generation was to scramble for gold. In the summer of 1832, when the hunters came down to Pierre's Hole for their supplies, there were trappers who had never before summered away from Detroit and Mackinac and Hudson Bay. There were half-wild Frenchmen from Quebec who had married Indian wives and cast off civilization as an ill-fitting garment. There were Indian hunters with the mellow, rhythmic tones that always betray native blood. There were lank New Englanders under Wyeth of Boston, erect as a mast pole, strong of jaw, angular of motion, taking clumsily to buckskins. There were the Rocky Mountain men in tattered clothes, with unkempt hair and long beards, and a trick of peering from their bushy brows like an enemy from ambush. They were probably odd detachments from Captain Bonneville's adventurers on the Platte, where a gay army adventurer was trying his luck as fur trader and explorer. And there was a new set of men, not yet weather-worn by the wilderness, alert, watchful, ubiquitous, scattering themselves among all groups where they could hear everything, see all, tell nothing, always shadowing the Rocky Mountain men who knew every trail of the wilds and should be good pilots to the best hunting grounds. By the middle of July, all business had been completed, and the trappers spent a last night round campfires, spinning yarns of the hunt. Early in the morning, when the Rocky Mountain men were sallying from the valley, they met a cavalcade of 150 Blackfeet. Each party halted to survey its opponent. In less than 10 years, the Rocky Mountain men had lost more than 70 comrades among hostiles. Even now the Indians were flourishing a flag captured from murdered Hudson's Bay hunters. The number of whites disconcerted the Indians. Their warlike advance gave place to friendliness. One chief came forward with a hand of comity extended. The whites were not deceived. Many a time had Rocky Mountain trappers been lured to their death by such overtures. No excuse is offered for the hunters. The code of the wilderness never lays the unction of a hypocritical excuse to conscience. The trappers sent 2 scouts to parley with a detested enemy. One trapper, with Indian blood in his veins and Indian thirst for the avengement of a kinsman's death in his heart, grasped the chief's extended hand with the clasp of a steel trap. On the instant, the other scout fired. The powerless chief fell dead, and using their horses as a breastwork, the Blackfeet hastily threw themselves behind some timber, cast up trenches, and shot from cover. All the trappers at the rendezvous spurred to the fight, priming guns, casting off valuables, making their wills as they rode. The battle lasted all day, and when under cover of night the Indians withdrew, 12 men lay dead on the trappers' side, as many more were wounded, and the Blackfeet's loss was twice as great. For years this tribe exacted heavy atonement for the death of warriors behind the trenches of Pierre's Hole. Leaving Pierre's Hole, the mountaineers scattered to their rocky fastnesses, but no sooner had they pitched camp on good hunting grounds than the strangers who had shadowed them at the rendezvous came up. Breaking camp, the Rocky Mountain men would steal away by new and unknown passes to another valley. A day or two later, having followed by tent poles dragging the ground, or brushwood broken by the passing packers, the pertinacious rivals would reappear. This went on persistently for 3 months. Infuriated by such tactics, the mountaineers planned to lead the spies a dance. Plunging into the territory of hostiles, they gave their pursuers the slip. Neither party probably intended that matters should become serious, but that is always the fault of the white man when he plays the dangerous game of war with Indians. The spying party was ambushed, the leader slain, his flesh torn from his body, and his skeleton thrown into the river. A few months later, the Rocky Mountain traders paid for this escapade. Fitzpatrick, the same trapper who had lifted Ogden's furs and led this game against the spies, was robbed among Indians instigated by white men of the American Fur Company. This marked the beginning of the end with the Rocky Mountain trappers. The American Fur Company, which Mr. Astor had organized and stuck to through good repute and evil repute, was now officered by Ramsey Crooks and Farnham and Robert Stewart, who had remained loyal to Mr. Astor in Astoria and been schooled in a discipline that offered no quarter to enemies. The purchase of the Mackinaw Company gave the American Company all those posts between the Great Lakes and the height of land dividing the Mississippi and Missouri. When Congress excluded foreign traders in 1816, all the Nor'westers' posts south of the boundary fell to the American Fur Company, and sturdy old Nor'westers who had been thrown out by the amalgamation with the Hudson's Bay also added to the American strength. Kenneth Mackenzie, with Laidlaw, Lament, and Kip, had a line of posts from Green Bay to the Missouri held by an American to evade the law, but known as the Columbia Company. This organization the American Fur Company bought out, placing Mackenzie at the mouth of the Yellowstone, where he built Fort Union and became the poobah of the whole region, living in regal style like his ancestral Scottish chiefs. King of the Missouri, white men called him. Big Indian me, the Blackfeet said, and Big Indian me he was to them, for he was the first trader to win both their friendship and the Crows. Here Mackenzie entertained Prince Maximilian of Weed and Catlin the artist and Audubon the naturalist, and had as his constant companion Hamilton, an English nobleman living in disguise and working for the Fur Company. Many an unmeant drama was enacted under the walls of Union in Mackenzie's reign. Once a free trapper came floating down the Missouri with his canoe full of beaver pelts, which he quickly exchanged for the gay attire to be obtained at Fort Union. Oddly enough, though the fellow was a French-Canadian, he had long, flaxen hair, of which he was inordinately vain. Strutting about the courtyard, feeling himself a very prince of importance, he saw Mackenzie's pretty young Indian wife. Each paid the other the tribute of adoration that was warmer than it was wise. The denouement was a vision of the flaxen-haired Siegfried sprinting at the top of his speed through the fort gate, with the irate Mackenzie flourishing a flail to the rear. The matter did not end here. The outraged Frenchman swore to kill Mackenzie on sight and haunted the fort gates with a loaded rifle, till Mackenzie was obliged to hire a mulatto servant to wing the fellow with a shot in the shoulder when he was brought into the fort, nursed back to health, and sent away. At another time, 2 Rocky Mountain trappers built an opposition fort just below Union and lay in wait for the coming of the Blackfeet to trade with the American Fur Company. Mackenzie posted a lookout on his bastion. The moment the Indians were descried, out sallied from Fort Union a band in full regalia, with drum and trumpet and piccolo and fife, wonders that would have lured the astonished Indians to perdition. Behind the band came gaudy presents for the savages, and what was not supposed to be in the Indian country, liquor. When these methods failed to outbuy rivals, Mackenzie did not hesitate to pay $12 for a beaver skin not worth $2. the Rocky Mountain trappers were forced to capitulate, and their post passed over to the American Fur Company. In the ruins of their post was enacted a fitting finale to the turbulent conflicts of the American traders. The Deschamps family, who had perpetrated the worst butcheries on the field of Seven Oaks in the fight between Hudson's Bay and Nor'westers, had acted as interpreters for the Rocky Mountain trappers. Boastful of their murderous record in Canada, the father, mother, and 8 grown children were usually so violent in their carousals that Hamilton, the English gentleman, used to quiet their outrage and prevent trouble by dropping laudanum in their cups. Once they slept so heavily that the whole fort was in a panic lest their sleep lasted to eternity, but the revelers came to life defiant as ever. At Union was a very handsome young half-breed fellow by the name of Gardepi, whose life the Deschamps harpies attempted to take from sheer jealousy and love of crime. Joined by 2 free trappers, Gardepi killed the elder Deschamps one morning at breakfast with all the gruesome mutilation of Indian custom. He at the same time wounded a younger son. Spurred by the hag-like mother and nerved to the deed with alcohol, the Deschamps undertook to avenge their father's death by killing all the whites of the fur post. One man had fallen when the alarm was carried to Fort Union. Twice had the Deschamps robbed Fort Union. Many trappers had been assassinated by a Deschamps. Indians had been flogged by them for no other purpose than to inflict torture. Beating on the doors of Fort Union, the wife of their last victim called out that the Deschamps were on the warpath. The traders of Fort Union solemnly raised hands and took an oath to exterminate the murderous clan. The affair had gone beyond Mackenzie's control. Seizing cannon and ammunition, the traders crossed the prairie to the abandoned fort of the Rocky Mountain trappers, where the murderers were entrenched. All valuables were removed from the fort. Time was given for the family to prepare for death. Then the guns were turned on the house. Suddenly that old harpy of crime, the mother, rushed out, holding forward the Indian pipe of peace and begging for mercy. She got all the mercy that she had ever given and fell shot through the heart. At last the return firing ceased. Who would enter and learn if the Deschamps were all dead? Treachery was feared. The assailants set fire to the fort. In the light of the flames, one man was espied crouching in the bastion. A traitor rushed forward exultant to shoot the last of the Deschamps, but a shot from the bastion sent him leaping 5 feet into the air to fall back dead, and a yell of fiendish victory burst from the burning tower. Again the assailants fired a volley. No answering shot came from the fort. Rushing through the smoke, the traders found Francois Deschamps backed up in a corner like a beast at bay, one wrist broken and all ammunition gone. A dozen rifle shots cracked sharp. The fellow fell, and his body was thrown into the flames. The old mother was buried without shroud or coffin in the clay bank of the river. A young boy mortally wounded was carried from the ruins to die in Union. This dark act marked the last important episode in the long conflict among traders. A decline of values followed the Civil War. Settlers were rushing overland to Oregon, and Fort Union went into the control of the militia. Today, St. Louis is still a center of trade in manufactured furs, and St. Paul yet receives raw pelts from trappers who wander through the forests of Minnesota and Idaho and the mountains. Only a year ago, the writer employed as guides in the mountains 3 trappers who have spent their lives ranging the northern wilds and the upper Missouri. But outside the mountain and forest wastes, the vast hunting grounds of the famous old trappers have been chalked off by the fences of settlers. In Canada, too, bloodshed marked the last of the conflict. Once in the 70s, when Louis Riel, a half-breed demagogue, roused the Métis against the surveyors sent to prepare Red River for settlement, and again in 1885 when this unhanged rascal incited the half-breeds of the Saskatchewan to rebellion over title deeds to their lands. Though the Hudson's Bay Company had nothing to do with either complaint, the conflict waged round their forts. In the first affair, the ragged army of rebels took possession of Fort Garry, and for no other reason than the love of killing that riots in savage blood, as in a wolf's, shot down Scott outside the fort gates. In the second rebellion, Riel's allies came down on the far isolated Fort Pitt, 300 strong, captured the fort, and took the factor, Mr. McLean, and his family to northern wastes, marching them through swamps breast high with spring floods, where General Middleton's troops could not follow. The children of the family had been in the habit of bribing old Indian gossips into telling stories by gifts of tobacco, and the friendship now stood the white family in good stead. Day and night, in all the weeks of captivity, the friendly Indians never left the side of the trader's family, slipping between the hostiles and the young children, standing guard at the tepee door, giving them weapons of defense till all were safely back among the whites. This time Riel was hanged, and the Hudson's Bay Company resumed its sway of all that realm between Labrador and the Pacific north of the Saskatchewan. Traders' lives are like a white paper with a black spot. The world looks only at the black spot. In spite of his faults, when in conflict with rivals, it has been the trader living alone, unprotected and unfearing, one voice among 1,000, who has restrained the Indian tribes from massacres that would have rolled back the progress of the West a quarter of a century. End of section 5.